And with that, Mr. Nadler, please.
Thank you. Let me first say that with respect to what Mr. Tiffany said, we may have a disagreement over whether FISA was abused in a certain case or not with respect to the former president. That doesn't affect our deliberations now. We all agree that FISA has been massively abused, and we've got to fix it. Mr. Kike, and the idea of eliminating qualified immunity here is a good one. I'd like to eliminate qualified immunity entirely. Mr. Keiko, in the 3 months since this committee last held a hearing on FISA, we learned that the FBI conducted unminimized warrantless backdoor searches of campaign donors, George Floyd protesters, and many others. If the FBI sought to search Americans' communications, no matter the reason, they would normally need a warrant under the Fourth Amendment. Could you briefly explain to us why the court has found warrantless searches of the 702 database to be acceptable under the Constitution? Mr. Kiko.
I don't think a warrantless search is acceptable under the Constitution, and that was what was anticipated when the Fourth Amendment was created.
No, we agree on that. My question is, why has the court found warrantless searches of the 702 database to be acceptable under the Constitution?
I haven't looked at that particular question, so I would ask a panel member to
Anybody else? Ms. Goitin?
I'd be happy to answer that. The FISA court has found that warrantless searches are constitutional. The FISA court has essentially said as long as the initial collection was lawful, then you apply some kind of lower standard to analyzing the queries rather than treating it as a separate Fourth Amendment event. However, Section 702 has recently made its way to the regular federal courts. And I say recently because for many years the government was not providing notice to criminal defendants, so there was no way to raise the issue. But in the past few years, regular federal courts have had a chance to look at this question, and there is a divide among those courts. You have 4 district court judges holding that these searches are constitutional, and then you have 4 appellate court judges expressing serious constitutional concerns. The only federal appellate court to rule directly on this question was a unanimous 3-judge panel of the Second Circuit, which held that you do have to treat the query as a separate Fourth Amendment event, subject to its own reasonableness analysis. And the Supreme Court has made clear that warrantless searches are presumptively unreasonable unless they fall within an established exception to the warrant requirement, such as consent or exigent circumstances. The Second Circuit remanded to the district court to conduct that analysis. So the courts, it is far from settled that these queries are constitutional.
And Mr. Ranking Member, could I just add one thing as well to that, and that is this was a reference to the Hasbarami case in the Second Circuit, and I agree with everything that was being said. One of the barriers that we see in federal court is that people have been denied standing in order to challenge these issues.
Ms. Goitin, the number of searches conducted among U.S. person identifiers went from 3.4 million in 2021 to less than 120,000 in 2022. Can you explain what remedial measures the DOJ put in place to reduce the number and whether you consider these changes sufficient to protect Americans from unwanted surveillance?
Sure. The FBI imposed some new training requirements, some new oversight requirements. It changed its data systems in various ways, and these changes resulted in the searches, as you say, going from 3.4 million to 200,000 searches. Now, I would say that one warrantless search of Americans' communications is too many. 200,000 warrantless searches, that's 500 warrantless searches for our communications every day. That is just a jaw-dropping number. And the fact that the FBI seems proud of that number really tells you how little regard they have for American civil liberties. They have made these changes according to the FBI's own internal study. Non-compliance has been reduced to 4%. I think there are a lot of reasons to question that number, but even if you accept that number, 4% of 200,000 searches, that's 8,000 searches every year that violate the FBI's own low standard.
Thank you, Ms. Goitin. How can FISA be modernized to protect America's communications that are inadvertently acquired through Section 702? What would be the impact of such changes on our national security? But how can they be, what should we do, in other words?
Right, so I think the solution is to require a warrant or a FISA Title I order in order to conduct these queries, and the government has put forward absolutely no evidence and no reason to believe that that would harm our national security. After all this time, the government has managed to come up with 3 examples of situations where U.S. person queries were useful. The government has been very vague about exactly how those queries happened or were used and how they produced the benefit that the government is claiming. But more importantly, the government has given no reason to think that a warrant requirement or a Title I order requirement would have prevented the queries from occurring. So for example, there's the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack. In that case, the queries took place after the attack. So there would certainly be probable cause to support any query that would return evidence of a crime. And similarly, there were queries to try to identify and protect
The gentleman's time has expired.
potential victims of assassination plots. And I would argue that surely these potential victims would have consented to a search had the FBI bothered to ask.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you.